we used to have these like kind of Twitter spaces or talks with the public about like what we are building a while back. But I think one of the things that we realized recently is that there's a whole new set of people kind of learning about Saga for the first time, and a lot of the concepts and kind of the history of why we are here and what we are building. It would be helpful for us to have essentially like a recap, I think, for now, and then I'm sure we'll have a lot of these, just talking about why we are building Saga to begin with, to the new folks who are here. And so, considering we have just launched mainnet last week, there's probably a lot of people who are here, heard about Saga, just kind of briefly about this like somewhat gaming related, somewhat infinite horizontal scalability chain, but don't know the full details about like how we're approaching that and what's different about us versus like other solutions. And so this is kind of like the purpose of today's Stack Exploder series. I'm gonna try to make this as simple as possible. I think I'm trying to remember back to the time period when I first joined blockchain, like around 2018, and how complicated everything was, and so I'll try my best, as Micah mentioned from the Saga account. I will try to make this as friendly and easy as possible, so everyone can kind of understand this. So, what's up?
No. Go ahead.
So you mentioned my introduction. I guess I can talk about myself really quickly. Let's gloss over that that portion though. So my name is Jen. I'm one of the co-founders here. Been here since the beginning of the project, and before this, essentially, I was in a company called Tendermint. Essentially, Tendermint was the official name of Tendermint is called All in Bits, so that's not really that important. The company was behind essentially the technology stack called Cosmos, and we launched. I was there when we launched the Cosmos Hub Atom, essentially back in 2019, and it's been 5 years. So I was in Tendermint for about 4 or 5 years. This project, actually, Saga, was birthed originally inside of Tendermint, almost as an incubated entity. The original kind of team kind of budded off from there. We had like a vision essentially of what we wanted to build, and decided that it's better to do it kind of independently from the various folks and team members that were existing in the ecosystem, to build something kind of slightly different than what people are used to. And so to really understand what Saga is about, you kind of need to go back and understand Cosmos. And to understand Cosmos, you kind of need to understand broadly what the history of general blockchains is. And so I just wanted to begin this conversation just going back, recapping kind of the history of how development in the blockchain space has kind of evolved, and then it will become clear kind of why Saga was needed at the time and is still needed, essentially. And so maybe before I begin my tirade, Micah, did you have anything else you wanted to add quickly, or?
No, I don't think so. I think that's like a pretty good like kickoff point. I'll play kind of Sherpa for this conversation, guys. I'll pop back in and out with some questions for Jen, some stuff that I've obviously grilled him on 100 times in the past, and some stuff that's some new questions. But yeah, I think Jen, this is like the right place to start. I think like let's go back in time a bit. Start with maybe, well, we want to get to like the motivation of like why Saga we believe is necessary for the space and how we think it's a differentiator, but this probably requires a little bit of a history lesson. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. So originally, let's start with single cell organisms. No, I'm just kidding. That's a little too far back. So if you let's start with like Bitcoin, right? So the nice thing about Bitcoin, obviously, was it's a blockchain. It's the first blockchain, but you couldn't really do much besides sending and receiving tokens. And so right after Bitcoin came out, there was a lot of these like what you would consider Bitcoin clones. It uses the Bitcoin code base, but changes the parameters just a little bit. So things like Litecoin, there was like a whole bunch of these And then the next big kind of innovation came with Ethereum. The idea was, instead of just putting information about people's balances and sending transactions on the blockchain, you could put arbitrary state on the blockchain itself, on the ledger itself, which kind of kickstarted this whole you can start programming decentralized applications on top of the blockchain. That was like the big innovation that Ethereum brought in when they launched. But one of the problems that Ethereum faced, and in general, many kind of monolithic chains, even the ones existent today, face, is that kind of scaling out a singular blockchain is actually a really, really difficult task. You can try to optimize your stack as much as you can, but there's always going to be essentially a theoretical limit to how fast you can make a single blockchain. And the easiest way to kind of think about this in the context of history is, back in the day, every processor used to be single threaded. So there used to be one core essentially. And there used to be this thing where performance essentially was going gangbusters because, every, 1 year, 2 year, the product improvement to that single core was significant enough where there was, like new products to be made that made performance significantly better over time. So if you look at the processors back in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of performance gains you can get from kind of a singular core in the system. And then eventually that ran into almost like a theoretical limit. And most of the time these days, the performance gains that you get from computers is actually not from improving that single core. It's from actually starting to parallelize it and going into multi-core. So if you take a look at like a basic processor today, most of them will have something like 16, 32, 64 different cores in the system, which is what we consider horizontal scalability. And so what Ethereum and all these like monolithic chains ran into was that like they figured out pretty quickly that a single chain is not like a tenable solution because, as mentioned, the pace of innovation that can happen in improving a singular kind of monolithic chain is eventually going to run into this like wall that and so before that happens, it's beneficial for people to start branching out in this horizontal scaling fashion. And so there was kind of like many attempts at this, but one of the biggest and I would say most successful version of this in the beginning was Cosmos. And so what is Cosmos? Cosmos is essentially a way for people to build their own kind of separate versions of blockchains, essentially. And so it's a way for people to build what was called app chains, essentially. And the idea is, look, if one chain is going to get congested and there's going to be problems, it's like, why don't we just give control over to any developer who wants to build applications to be able to build their own application chain? And so this kind of proliferated. A lot of people get a little confused about what Cosmos is, because there's this thing called the Cosmos Atom, which is one version of the actual chain itself. But in fact, there's a lot of chains out there that is powered by Cosmos technology that a lot of people don't know that it is Cosmos. And so one of the most infamous example, obviously, is back in the day, Terra, was built on top of Cosmos. But to a certain extent, there's a lot of chains that exist today on in the world that's just like kind of powered by Cosmos in the background. So BNB chain, for example, used to be. I'm not exactly sure if they still are. Polygon was a early version that was kind of built on top of Tendermint and Cosmos, and they deviated away from that. But that's kind of like the basic basis of what Cosmos is. It's like, hey, you want to go launch a chain? Why don't you go launch a chain that's independent and separate from Ethereum? And by doing this, you're able to kind of scale out the potential amount of transactions you can have, because now you have like one chain that's powered, that has an independent set of validator sets that you can essentially launch that kind of segments the traffic into that one specific application chain. And once you have multiple of these, obviously it's a much easier way to scale. And so, I was in Tendermint kind of thinking about all of this, about Cosmos, about like this ideal dream of like being able to launch your own app chain. And I thought that was, this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so, that's kind of what I worked on for the for 5 years, from like 2018 to, or maybe 4 years, 2021-ish or something like that. And so it was really exciting, but one thing became very, very clear, which is, you can solve the technical aspect of launching a chain by using something like Cosmos. But in fact, the hard part of launching a chain is not really the technical part of it anymore. It actually is, a lot of it is a lot of extraneous things that exist in a blockchain to launch a chain, essentially. So here, like, let's talk about a certain number of examples, because Saga, the project itself, just went through this. We launched our mainnet. It's a Cosmos based chain. What do you need to do actually to launch a chain? You need to first figure out a staking token, right? You need to create a staking token model. You need to create an economic system where you can make the staking token valuable enough, essentially, so that validators will come. So now you have to go and gather validators. You need to convince these validators, oh, your system is worth running, because obviously running systems for validators is cost associated, cost and effort associated with them. And they will only do that if your staking token is going to be worth something in a little bit. You need to go and convince essentially a whole bunch of people out in the world that your staking token is worth something, so that people will need to stake this. You need to create now you've had kind of this economic system to figure out how to incentivize validators, how to incentivize individual holders. You need to create an overarching token economic system that everyone believes is going to be good for people to stake, essentially, to help secure the network. And all of this that we have just outlined takes many, many months. And this is kind of the big rub of the problem with the app chain solution, is that most of the time, as I said, the technical aspect of launching a chain is not that complicated. It's just that the coordination and all of the work that is required, essentially, to coordinate all of this is such a large amount of work that it takes, there's two big problems with this approach, essentially. One is that this only filters out projects who essentially are able to put in that months of work and effort to plan this, number one. And then number two, even if the project is so, like, sorry, going back to number one, the problem specifically with this is that there's no experimentation that essentially happens because of this. If you look at Cosmos, most chains, a lot of meme coins that come out on Cosmos, it's hard for them to survive because, meme coins, obviously, in Solana or other ecosystems, they just have to plan out a very small number of things. They have to, do the marketing. They have to do a lot of the stuff that's required for meme coins. But on top of that, when you have your own app chain, you got to manage the trillion other things that I just mentioned, essentially, on top of that with them. And so a lot of the times, it's very difficult for kind of more experimentation to happen, essentially, in this app chain setting. And
because we basically have the setting where if you're the builder, there's massive advantages to having your own chain, but all of these other components that go into building that and maintaining that and creating a strong model around it, absorb all of that work, right? You basically need an entire team that's just managing that one side of trying to figure out how to actually launch this chain, and then another team that's actually building whatever the product is on top of that, right?
That's correct. And there's many examples of this as well, but a really good example is DYDX. They used to have a non-app chain version of their application. They announced their plans to essentially transition into their own app chain, and it took a year, right? Maybe more, a year and a half, maybe, right? And while this is great, I think DYDX is a project that's a little bit more in tune with blockchain infrastructure, and so they can do that. But there are all these projects out there, like game studios or like other kind of projects out there that are not really infrastructure engineers, and especially not blockchain infrastructure engineers. And so while this like app chain model is fantastic and there's like a lot of benefits to it, you're not going to find this like giant proliferation of a whole bunch of developers coming in and adopting this app chain model if coming into it, it requires you to plan out something for like 10 months in something that you don't really quite understand, for example. So like game developers, for example, they would like to focus on their game and make their game good. They shouldn't focus on how to build like this infrastructure stack and launch, staking tokens and getting validators. Like all that stuff is like way, way, way over their heads, right? So that's like, let's start with that essentially. And so that was like the situation that I was looking at in Cosmos. I was like, great. It's like app chains, wonderful. Horizontal scalability, great. Using Cosmos, okay, this seems really fucking hard. Like no one's gonna do this. And since that realization that I had back in like 2021, things haven't changed that much, right? There's been some new app chains that has come out, but by and large, like the number of app chains that have come out since then is pretty relatively small. I would say. And so that I would say let's talk about like what is this specifically that makes, like, what is Saga essentially at that point. So all these issues that I've outlined is caused by essentially the need for developers to put in all these effort into securing the network, launching and coordinating the actual launch of the network, all of that essentially. And so my thought process was, hey, okay, let's why don't we actually build a product solution that solves this problem? We know that there's this app chain solution is where the future is, because that's how like everything in the world scales ultimately. And so this horizontal scalability is something that is worth pursuing. But the current methods of saying, hey, everyone, good luck with this code base and why don't you go run this chain is not working. So the idea of Saga ultimately was, let's build an end-to-end solution that automatically spins up chains for people who essentially just want a chain to work with or multiple chains to work with, but they just don't want that experience and that infrastructure knowledge that they need to go and actually provision the actual chain themselves. So that's like the I would say the first kind of origin of Saga is like, how do we build essentially that? Like, how do we make it so that someone can go and just click, I would say minimally like 3 buttons, and then they get a chain essentially, which simplifies this like 8-month process down to about 2 minutes, which is something that it was quite needed in this like app chain space. And so that's the at least the origins and the motivations behind why Saga was built. And maybe Micah, you can I'm pretty sure you have some questions at this point, but maybe
I think that breaks it down.
let's focus myself, because I will kind of ramble on about like a trillion different topics, and so I need your help focusing me in a direction. Actually,
No. You're good. You're good for sure. I think it makes sense. Like the history of like I love it starting with Bitcoin, even going back to the core computer sizes. But I think like at this point, it's like, okay, so Saga, the idea is at its core making this easier for those who are building an app in the blockchain space. We believe that there is massive advantages from having devoted block space to having your own chain that is fully only there to provision for you in the app that you're building. But technically, on a technical standpoint, in the past, this has been very, very difficult. What's like? Let's break down then Saga. So we created Saga. What is the actual architecture? Because obviously we just launched security chain with mainnet phase 1, and there's us as an L1 to launch L1s. What do these other chains look like? How does this kind of like waterfall of our like actual architecture look like? And please, again, explain it like it's five for those who are maybe not technical. We were talking about this yesterday about how blockchain's so fun because there's so many people here, like myself, that are not like technical people, but you're just find yourself pouring through documentation and trying to understand technical stuff all the time because you want to learn more about what's happening in the space. And obviously, there's just a DJ nature that goes with it. So maybe breaking down, just simply like what's the like architecture of how our chains are set up is probably pretty useful, especially for those who might be building.
Yep, yeah, of course. So as um as I talked about before, the big lift here for people who want their own chains ultimately is the security aspect of it. That's the biggest issue. Everything I mentioned before, validator, solicitation, staking token, getting people to stake, creating a token economic system for that, all that essentially is to get what is the end goal of that is to get security for your chain, to make sure that um, um, other chains will start having bridging transactions with you, all of that. That's the hard part about all this. And so um, uh, the Saga system essentially is divided kind of functionally. So I would say conceptually you can divide it into three different conceptual pieces. So the first is the security chain. The second is what we call the platform chain, and the third is what's called chainlets, essentially. So let's kind of break down and talk about each one's individually. So the Saga security chain, just take the vision, take a 10,000-foot view of this, is essentially where the security source is for the entire Saga ecosystem. I think we can expand upon that in the future, but as of right now, that's the truth, right? So if the product is this essentially, if it's hard for someone to solicit security, essentially, why don't we do it for them and share this security with those people who launch their chains? So that's like the step one of this, essentially. So the Saga security chain, what does it do? It does remarkably little, and it's by design. That's the purpose of this. So it does what every other proof of stake chain would do if someone would launch their own app chain. It allows somebody to stake their tokens, aka Saga tokens, onto the chain. It allows, it has a set of validators essentially that we have already gone and provisioned. And there's an economic system that exists already that has a locked value essentially associated with the Saga security chain. So that's like the baseline of what is needed. So now let's go to the platform chain. So the Saga platform chain, essentially, what it does is it itself does not have any security. It borrows that security essentially from the Saga security chain. And what the platform chain does is it coordinates essentially and automates the launching of new chains that are requested by developers. So let's say I'm a developer and I want to go and launch a new chain on Saga. What I do is traditionally what happened is either I went and, as I said, coordinated my own validator, created my own economic system, and I did everything myself and I launched it myself. Or I went and I talked to somebody. So there's a person essentially I talked to that's doing BD for some chain making application. And I need to be like, hey, can you go and build a chain for me? We create a contract. I pay them a certain amount, and they do this for us, right? None of that in Saga. What Saga platform chain does is it holds transactions to say, hey, please launch this chain for me, essentially. And what our software and our validators will do is automatically spin up new chains for people to interface with and coordinate with. And this is the final component, which is the chainlets, essentially. So what our platform chains does is it, let's say in the future, our platform chain has 20 validators. Then someone puts a transaction in the platform chain saying, hey, I would like to request the chain, essentially, of this configuration. And then what the 20 validators of our platform chain operator does is it spins up a whole new chain, a new chainlet, as we call it, that is run by the same 21 validators, right? And makes that available to the developer. And then that chainlet is essentially inherits the security from the platform chain, which then inherits security from this Saga security chain. And so there's a kind of like this daisy chaining that happens. And so by making this like system this way, what you allow yourself to do essentially is once you have this platform chain, you can actually have many people request chains at once. And now you have this kind of branching out effect. So from the security chain, you share your security to the platform chain, and the platform chain now shares security with thousands of chains on top, essentially, and coordinates that. And all of the essentially coordination of price of setting of like how much coordinating a chain happens, essentially all of that happens on chain on the Saga platform chain, essentially.
And then each of the chainlets underneath it are the individual app chains. And I explain this because I believe that like it's just a clone, right, of the platform chain. When somebody comes into create their own chainlet and they're, they put in the request, the validators, obviously like grant that, explain like what that process is, I guess, between, because we totally get it. Security chain just sits on its own. It's proof of stake. The platform chain is where the action is actually happening. And then what about the chainlets? Like what can they do or not do? What's the customization that's able to be built into them themselves for those who are like building?
Yeah. So the nice thing about this is this can be configured over time. And so the platform chain essentially when a developer requests a chainlet, we could have essentially right now there's an EVM chain essentially that a developer can request. However, you can imagine a scenario in which there's multiple different kinds of chainlets that someone can interface with the platform chain to launch. So, for example, let's say I want an EVM chain that's powered by Tendermint. Then I go to the platform and chain, and in my transaction, essentially to request a chain, I will say I would like EVM chain configuration with Tendermint. And what our system does in the background essentially is kind of the same thing that AWS does in the background. So, when a developer goes and the interaction is actually very keenly similar to how the cloud works. When a developer goes and talks to Amazon, for example, they say, "Hey, I want a server that's run with maybe Debian, right? And I want 4 cores of compute, essentially." And what AWS system essentially does, there's a software out there essentially that automatically coordinates and finds 4 cores worth of resources essentially somewhere in their super cluster of stuff, and will install essentially Debian and give you access to that Debian like server essentially. And there isn't a human essentially that really exists in that like equation. You can kind of automate most of this. And so this is the goal of what we want to build out. It's a user goes and talks to and uses kind of their wallet to interact with the platform chain, says, "Hey, I want an EVM chain powered by Tendermint," sends that transaction. Our validators that are running the platform chain are looking at that chain and saying, "Okay, somebody just requested this. They paid the prerequisite amount of payment that's required to launch this chain." And so we will essentially automatically, using software, spin up a new chain, create the actual security chain path between the security chain, the platform chain, and the actual chainlet itself, and then just give the endpoint to the users. And so the experience that we're trying to build for the developer ultimately is pretty identical to how cloud works. They don't have to know how any of this works. All they have to do is know how to request a chainlet ultimately and pay for a chainlet. That's the only 2 real equations that the developer really needs to think about when interacting with Saga ultimately, which is which is significantly simpler than trying to like launch their own chain ultimately, right?
I think it's like a pretty, like, this was like a light bulb moment for me for sure when I was like first kind of like digging into like what Saga is building, because I think for a lot of people who are just like listening in, or if you're not like in the development space, so much of we exist honestly, like we're here because we love the innovation that's coming with blockchain, but we all have to also admit that like we're somewhat in a transition period. Everything that happens in like a traditional building sense, like Jin just talked about with AWS, like these things are all automated systems, like provisioning compute for your app. Amazon doesn't have the account managers who are doing that like individually for each new project that wants to build on or use AWS. All of this stuff is automated, but so much that maybe we, as a dirty little secret of the blockchain space is much of this isn't automated. If people want to spin up a new chain and they're looking for another platform that can do that for them, or build out a subnet or these types of things, these are often manual processes, and that feels very much like a 1.5 in where we are in the blockchain space. And to truly get to, I think, the next iteration, to the next expansion point for blockchain in general, is taking all of these things that on the back end are manual processes that these developers typically have to go through, and automating them, mimicking what is already the efficiencies that we see in the traditional building space and the traditional tech scaling space, and bringing them here into blockchain. I hope I'm not like making this overly complicated, but I think that once you kind of understand to a certain extent, that core feature of Saga, this automation of the spinning up these chainlets, and the fact that this removes kind of the having to go through realistically like some layers of politicking to actually get this done, we really are going to become moving into this next stage of efficiency, moving into this next stage of automation, and truly like scale, not only scaling up from like a technical standpoint, but really just maturing in the blockchain space. It really, really is exciting. So,
man,
know,
you do a really good job
just
of explaining these things. I feel like I'm just like rambling on about like what, like all the technology stuff we're building, and then I'm listening to it and I'm like, wow, that's a much better way of saying it.
We talk so much about how like those of us who are in the space, if you're an alpha hunter and you're out there looking at cross projects, you're constantly like kind of zipping between like, I need to find the next meme coin, and then I need to dive deep and like understand like where is the actual like big jump happening from like a foundational level of innovation in blockchain space. And yeah, it's not cool for me to just sit here and say like, whoa guys, this is innovative, but at the same time I think like there is a little bit of like a before and after, I think, for Saga. Like once when we really like have this automated process of people being able to spin up their own chainlets, the ways in which it will just become so much easier, especially for those who are maybe not even in the Web3 space yet. Today, blockchain is still very, very there is friction for those that want to build here. And I think that from a big wave perspective, we really believe in this future of apps having their own chain and not having to mess around with having congestion and the other problems that come along with having to share block space with a bazillion other apps that are happening on a specific chain. If we feel that vision of the future of like a chain for every app is out there, then we can't have a manual process that sits in the center of that. There needs to be something that any project, whether or not you're just building a weather app, but you want it to be on the chain, and you want it to have its own chain to go along with it, so you can spin out as many texts as you want. That needs to be an automated process. I think that really is something that I think, we communicate this through a million different white papers, a million different blog posts, and I hope is something that can begin to sink in for people.
Yeah.
I think that I don't want to like skip too far down, Jin, but I think we're already talking a little bit about the builders and the advantage that they have of this being an automated process, but there's like economic benefits for the developers that come along with this as well. Right?
Yeah. So wait. Before we do that, I want to just reiterate something that you said, which was really important, which is, and I guess it kind of dovetails into this economic thing that you're alluding to. But one of the big issues is that blockchain has is if you're super into this space and you're a builder that's already in tune with infrastructure, like decentralized infrastructure already, then there's not a lot of problems. You can go and kind of do your own things, and it's fine. But if like for a new entrant, like for this space to really become mass scale and mass adopted, you need like the developers who are kind of like not familiar with it to come in and learn for the first time. And the learning process, like, I don't know how many of you guys have like programmed something before, but when you start programming, let's say like an application or building something, you start with, something simple. You don't think like, hey, I'm going to make $1 billion tomorrow with this application. You start with like, I'm going to make my own blog, or like, I'm going to make my own, whatever, like web application that might be helpful. But it is not like, the intention is not, hey, I want to create something that has economic value that earns revenue for people, right? Like that's generally how experimentation begins. And so like a college student experimenting with some of these like blockchain tools right now, it's very hard to do because as mentioned, app chains are kind of gated. Launching your own app chain is gated by how to make like economics is already like baked into the equation since the very beginning. And so if your project is not deemed as profitable for operators or validators to run, then your project just is not gonna exist, right? And so that gating essentially pushes a lot of experimentation out away from blockchain, which is essentially like a method in which you kill kind of new entrants into this ecosystem, right? And so from our perspective, ultimately, like lowering that barrier, bringing new folks from kind of Web 2 essentially into Web 3 by making this system in which someone can kind of experiment for free without worrying about whether or not validators will find that their application is useful or not, is something that's really, really needed ultimately in this space to bring this to mass market, right? So, in the past, somebody might have said, "Hey, I think this kind of tool is really interesting for me, and would be really interesting for other developers, but I have no idea how to monetize." Right? That is okay in Saga, because of the way that we've set the system up, and because of the way that we created kind of like this economic method, essentially, in which it allows developers to kind of launch chainlets and chains instantaneously, and also just like pay for it without worrying about the economics. Right now, it's like it's a really powerful tool. So let me quickly talk about what I'm talking about, because I've been a little bit like I guess like 10,000 foot view of like what I'm talking about. I didn't explicitly say what I was saying. So in Saga, essentially, the way it works is there's no like gas fee that's collected by the network itself. In our system, when let's say I launch a chainlet, and the users of my chainlet, let's say even if it's just myself, or let's say it's Jonathan, it's Rebecca, somebody, in a traditional blockchain system, the game is let's make block space as limiting as possible. And how do I extract value from that? I make people compete by having them spend more gas and then funnel that gas out into a select group of people so that they are benefiting from it, right? That's like usually the economics of how blockchain works. We don't do that. Our system essentially is if you spin up a chainlet and users use it, there is no gas that is essentially exiting this system out into some other like validator group or anything. Everything is essentially contained within that chain that we have launched. And so what we can offer ultimately is that we build a way in which a developer can directly pay for the chainlets itself. And we have systems in place essentially that allows chainlets to be commoditized and cheap. And so going back to the analogy with AWS, think of it this way, right? Like when someone tries to write a web application and decides that they're going to run on AWS doesn't say, hey, can you, for all revenues that you generate on top of our platform, we would like a slice of that, essentially, maybe 10%, and you're going to have to pay us in perpetuity for that. That's how Web3 development works right now. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense, right? That doesn't happen in Amazon. What Amazon says is, okay, like we don't care. Why don't you just pay us, $10 a month, essentially, right? And we will provision this like web space for you, this server space. And Saga works very, very similarly. There's a direct payment that happens from the developer to stand up these chainlets, essentially. And then from that point on, the economic system of that chain is 100% controlled by the developer, which means that there's no value that's getting extracted out from the actual application back into Saga. It's a much more it's a economic flow that's already existent in and already kind of familiar to most developers out there today. Essentially, we believe that the economic system of most Web3 infrastructure projects is very odd and is very untenable for developers. And so this is a kind of like another way in which we make it much more simpler and easier for developers to kind of onboard, because number one, your chain launches automatically, and number two, you don't have to worry about kind of like this like value extraction that happens in most other chains out there today. So
you're giving me terrifying flashbacks to the 2021 gas wars of NFT like mania on Ethereum. I know that. I think that that's like a really, this is like light bulb moment. Hopefully, number two for some of the people who are like listening in. It's the Jim would go off for an hour talking about how like we don't want to say like gasless, because obviously there is like actually, yes, it happens, but we really deeply believe in like extracting that process away from the end user. The end user is not paying gas fees on their chainlet. The person who's building the app can figure out how they want to maybe monetize on the users that are there. Obviously, that's why a lot of people are building in the Web3 space. But this idea that every single block transaction needs value extracted from it to go back out to somebody else. Again, we just think it's like that in between model, right? Where we're in the growing pains of the blockchain space, but long term, we're going to end up something like every other traditional tech stack out there, where if you're a builder, you want to just pay a flat fee per month to have a component. You know, for AWS, it's that flat fee of how much you want for compute. For us, it's going to be that flat fee for how much you want for your chainlet to survive and stay alive and scale, right?
yeah. And so like the correct economic flow is let me describe the flow of how it should work in how things work in like the real world. I would call it, it's the Web 2 world essentially. So let's say I'm using Uber, right? And Uber uses Amazon as their compute server, right? Uber, when a user calls a taxi, I pay Uber like the fees to use Uber services. And then Uber figures out from that how to pay for their infrastructure. So there is a completely separate but a direct relationship between customer and Uber. And then you can segment it out and from Uber to Amazon, essentially. And then the user has no idea what is going on in the front end, essentially. Right? That Uber is using Amazon. They could be using some other services. It doesn't really matter. This is the flow that we believe in the future that Web3 has to embrace in order for it to actually get adopted by mainstream. So the same situation. Let's say, let's call it Uniswap. Maybe Uniswap one day launches on Saga as a chainlet. The user interacts and pays Uniswap for using their services, but has no idea essentially that Saga is in the background. They don't need to worry about paying Saga. There's nothing that happens. The economic flow and the relationship is directly between the developer and the end user, right? The developer can figure out, do they want to charge a subscription fee? Do they want to charge per transaction the same way that it does before? But the relationship is direct between Uniswap and the end user. And then separately in the background, the developer, Uniswap or some other developer, has a relationship with Saga to pay for infrastructure in the backend, right? There isn't this like tunnel that exists from Saga all the way to the end user. Be like, hey, can you use Saga tokens to pay for gas fees? That like sneaks in there and like extracts value away from people. That doesn't happen essentially. And so this kind of economic system is a much more not only developer friendly but user friendly system ultimately. And the traditional Web3 economic system of like relying on gas fee as the method to derive value for your network is not going to be tenable in a world where developer can launch infinitely parallel versions of chains, essentially, kind of the world that Saga exists in. And so this is a space that's very ripe for disruption. A lot of people don't talk about economic system improvements and innovations that are happening in this space, because those happen very slowly, but generally. But this is like something that's completely different and unique, essentially, on Saga, that most other chains are not even thinking about, because they're relying upon the old methods of value extraction from the infrastructure, from the applications ultimately. And so, yeah.
It's probably easiest for us to talk also, like, as we talk about, like, okay, what are the benefits that are coming out of like the Saga method? Like, most people here, just, it's easier just to compare it. Like, let's compare it to like L1s, or compare to roll-ups. Like, what's happening in the space now versus what I think like we're trying to build to as this future state.
Yeah. So that's actually a really good question, and it's very nuanced. And so, I started diving into rollups, L2s, because, as I said, my history is coming from app chains, and I'm like, okay, app chains make sense. I understand what the limitations are. It's hard to provision. There's like, these limitations, but app chains are great. And then along came rollups, and I'm like, what the fuck is rollups? And then I've been like kind of like grokking and trying to understand what the difference between the two is. And I think philosophically, there is something kind of fundamentally different about the way that we're approaching things. And this kind of ties to the economic systems that we just talked about. So for us, for Saga, if you want to create a system in which value essentially is isolated between, it's a relationship between the end customer and the developer, and there's a clean cut between that and developer and infrastructure relationships, essentially, you can't have, like, you have to kind of vertically own the entire technology stack for that to happen. So what does this mean? So in a roll-up world, your block production is kind of split up into different components, right? So you have the DA component, you have the settlement component, you have all these different components. And if you're a roll-up, you need to kind of individually manage the economic flows that happens between your roll-up and all these different components. So let's say I'm roll-up X. You need to pay, for example, Celestia or Ethereum or Eigenlayer for your DA separately from where you're settling. So when you're settling, you need to pay for settling onto that chain on Ethereum. Maybe you're doing it on some other chain, et cetera, right? So fundamentally, your economic system has sinks that you have to pay out to as a roll-up ultimately. And this is not a tenable solution, because unless those individual places that you are paying to are also thinking about your system in a way where you want to create like a cohesive and non-value extractive economic system, you're just going to have to pay that eventually to those folks. So here's an example. Let's say I'm using Celestia DA, and one day Celestia starts getting super congested. Their token economic system is not based on like a cohesive and commoditized block space. So if a bunch of people start using Celestia, the price of Celestia starts going up, which then I have to go and bear, essentially, because I'm the one who has to pay Celestia this amount of money, right? So what essentially ends up happening is these roll-ups starts. It gets very confusing for the developer, because there's value extractions that are happening in different places. Each of those places, whether it's DA, whether it's settlement, all have different economic methods. And so for me as a developer to plan an actual application in which I want to project out like how much it will cost for me to run this, it becomes almost untenable. And this is kind of like generally the problem with Web3 today. The costs and the effort required to essentially maintain an application is not dependent on me or my infrastructure. That's a very strange thing. It like let's say like I'm some DEX, and it costs me, let's say, $10,000 to run a month, and suddenly this meme coin pops in like Ethereum, and suddenly my application it takes $100,000 a month to run. These are things that as a developer is impossible to control. And it becomes very difficult for builders to essentially build in this space. And this is like essentially always the issue. There's like, ebbs and flows of how popular block space is. And so the cost of these block spaces go back and forth. And so that being said, sorry, I've been like rambling a little bit about this. That's fundamentally the difference between kind of rollups and how Saga functions. Is we bring in all of that essentially components that is required for block space, and we automate that automatically. You don't have to worry about individually managing economic flows to different components. You don't have to manage all of that. Essentially, it's a simple system that allows you to launch block space without worrying about different, like hundreds of thousands of different components that you need to worry about in like a modular world ultimately. And so that's the short end of it. There's a lot of like other things, obviously, that's technically difference between the two, but that's going to be the biggest like kind of crux of it ultimately, that it differentiates Saga over like other kinds of block space projects that you see essentially.
Yeah, I think that it's a good spot for us to kind of like again like pause and kind of regroup on. I think because it gets lost in the mix. I mean, obviously we're infrastructure and we're talking to a lot of people in this space, and the builders. I think oftentimes you just kind of put up with what you have, and like you said, the pace of innovation is slow. But ultimately, this is like a huge issue as we scale to the next billion or 2 billion people who are going to participate in the blockchain space. All these app developers who have to essentially their cost structure is not dependent on themselves, which is just very, very different. If you've been a part of a startup, or if you've been a part of any company where you kind of understand like managing your costs, having all these external factors, typically when you're building other spaces that ultimately have an effect on you, we just don't foresee that as something that really is going to get us to the next, billion people on the blockchain, because ultimately you then have to drive those costs down to your customer or your user or whatever it is. And this is just not how we scale. I think it's not how we build into the future.